Hi, I'm Dan Music. In this video, we'll show you how to convert from an easy set spring system to standard torsion springs. So in this first video, we'll show you the more common type of conversion where you have a shaft that has a coupler in the middle and also only one spring. To begin, we separate the left shaft from the coupler by removing the screw. And then we want to make sure that the shaft is free to turn. So when we take it apart at the other end, it'll slide out. So here on the left end, we'll begin disassembling the easy set system. Notice here you have your tube retainer, the end bracket that all this is attached to, the shaft, the cable drum, the winder, and the spring. Usually when a spring breaks, the spring stays connected to the winder, but sometimes the tabs break in the winder and the spring will separate, as you see here. To begin, we first remove the retainer. Normally the bolt is lower, but there wasn't a hole down there on this system. The purpose of the retainer is to keep the shaft from jumping out of the track if there's some kind of an accident. I was on a door a number of years ago and didn't have a tube retainer, and the shaft almost came down and hit a car. Next, we remove the cable from the drum and position it in the hinge so it doesn't drop to the floor. So next, we loosen the set screws in the cable drum. Then we rotate the drum, and we have the set screw on the other side. Now the drum turns freely. So at this point, we're going to pry the winder out of the end bracket. And while holding it, I slide the cable drum off the tube. Next, I'll loosen the set screws on the cone. At this point, I'm going to slide the spring over toward the middle. As I start to slide it, notice that the cone has separated from the winding unit. The reason it separated was that when the spring broke, it jerked and broke the tabs on it. That's one of the reasons we don't like the easy set system, because of the plastic parts. And these can get pretty expensive. We're going to take this whole thing and slide it over toward the middle. At this point, we go to the right side and disassemble the easy set system. First, remove the cable, put it in the hinge, put the end in the hinge. So next, we remove the tube retainer, 9/16 socket. So we remove the tube retainer on this side. So at this point, I'll loosen the set screws on the cable drum. Two set screws, rotate it 180 degrees. Loosen the second set screw. So at this point, we slide off the cable drum and the end bearing support. At this point, we're going to remove the left shaft from the coupler. So to do this, we need 2 vice grips. You can also use 1 vice grip. There are a number of ways to get this. In the trade, we use vice grips for just about everything. You can see where the hole has a burr, which is binding in the coupler. So we pull this out. When you do that, the weight of the spring pulls on this. So at this point, you can center the spring and bring it to the floor. At this point, I'll show you how to install a standard torsion spring on a Clopay Easy Set system. We've already removed the shaft. Now, one thing to remember about Clopay Easy Set springs is that because of the smaller drums, the springs are a lot longer and the cable drums are smaller, and you put more turns on it. For a standard torsion spring, for a 7-foot high door, for example, you may wind it 7.5 turns. But on an easy set spring, it's usually about 10.5 or 11 turns. Here's the spring that we'll be installing on the door. It's 36 inches long. On a regular door, it would only lift about maybe 100 pounds. On an easy set system, when you wind it 10.5 turns, it will pick up this 159-pound door. So to begin, we loosen the set screws. And then slide the bearing and the spring onto the shaft. So the bearing has 2 sides. The narrower goes there, so it'll fit in the cone. At this point, I'll lift the spring and the shaft into place. Notice that the coupler on this end supports the shaft while we reassemble everything down here. Notice 2 things. One is that this is a left wind spring, just as the old one was. You notice also that the left wind spring has a black cone. The other thing to notice is that the earlier spring was gapped, which would have made it about 42 inches. If you take that 42-inch spring and push the coils together, it'll only be 36 inches. So we're using an ungapped spring, and this is only 36 inches. Same wire size, just doesn't have the gaps in it. On the easy set springs, you know they're gapped because you can take a dollar bill and place it between the coils. You can't do that on one of these standard torsion springs. It doesn't go in. But let's go over here and look at get the easy set spring. Now you can see the gaps in this spring. If you take a dollar bill, it'll slide right between the gaps. So to reinstall the winder, we have the end with the clips that face the spring before going on first, and then this on top. So we put this on here, and then the cable drum, the part where the cable comes out, will go on the outside. So we bring this over here, and then this slides in like that. Notice you have to slide that in with the cable drum next to it, otherwise the drum won't go in. If you're up here and you try to slide it down, it's just going part way, but then you have to slide the drum over and then it'll slide down. So at this point, we'll reinstall the tube retainer and then secure that with a 3/8 bolt and nut. Earlier, I had left this a little loose when we put the legs in. So notice that all the hardware is in place here. We're not going to use the winder, but we need the bearing inside the winder. So at this point, we're going to install the bracket and the spring. Now, depending on the structure inside the garage, where the drywall is, where the studs are, you can put the spring anywhere along the shaft here. We're going to show it right here, just as a matter of convenience. The spring bracket will go right here. But notice that we need some more wood up here. Center the bracket and go to the top. When installing the bracket, I'm going to keep it plumb. I've seen a lot of doors over the years where the bracket wasn't plumb and it wore a groove into the shaft. I've even seen them break the shaft. Still Still wrong. Came up a little bit. I think we're okay. Yeah.
The main thing is you don't want it turning or
Right.
wearing on the shaft.
Okay. So the bracket is secure. Now we install the bolts. Okay. At this point, I will line the holes and secure the coupler to the shaft. The easier way to do this is to pull the shaft out, careful to support it, and then you can see the hole. And push it in, and there it's aligned. So now we secure the coupler to the shaft. So at this point, I want you to notice that the shaft is perfectly level all the way across. So you see out there at the left how the shaft is about an inch above the mark at the top of the beam. You go across, and that 1 inch distance is the same all the way across. Very slightly, but a lot of that's because of the 2x4 not being perfectly straight. At this point, we install a cable on the outer groove. Now notice the distance between the drum and the race of the bearing. If there's a gap like that, when we're finished, the drum will scrape the bracket and cause the cables to come off. You can actually hear it scraping. You don't want to hear that scraping. What's confusing for a lot of door installers is the first time they install one of these, we're accustomed to the bearing being over here, and you push the drum against the bearing. Here, you push the drum against this bearing so it goes to the left rather than to the right. Because if it goes to the right, it scrapes. You bring it this way, it doesn't scrape. Now, we need to do two things at this point. One is to keep the cable on the drum while we work at the other end. The other thing that we want to do is keep the shaft from sliding back to the right. So in order to do this, we pull on the shaft, torquing it so the cable's tight, and then put a vice grip right next to the end bearing and against the header or the whatever structure you have. So now the cable's tight, and you can't move it to the right. And if you see in here that there's no space between the cable drum and the brace of the bearing. They always need to be tight on both sides. The reason for this is that when you wind the spring on the other side, we're going to stretch it and it's going to be pulling the shaft. Now, if this is tight, it's not going to pull it any, and if it doesn't pull here, it's not going to pull the one on the other side. Because if this is loose, we tighten the spring, it pulls the shaft, and then that cable drum down there scrapes. When we're on the other side, the cable drum was already secured to the shaft. So the steps over there are you secure the cable drum to the shaft, you turn the shaft so the cable is tight, and then you vice grip the shaft to keep the cable tight on the drum. Over here, because the cable drum is already secured to the shaft and this one is free, we put the cable on the drum first and then turn the drum instead of the shaft. Now the important thing over here to remember is you want the cable drum against the bearing on the right. If it's on the left, it scrapes. Especially when you wind the spring, it's going to want to pull the shaft that way. You don't want it scraping. You put it over here and it's quiet. So the first thing we do is we pull the shaft, make sure it won't move to the left. Push the drum against the bearing, and then wind the cable onto the drum. So we install the cable in the end of the drum. But you want to make sure that the end of it is not sticking out because it can catch on the bracket and cause the cable to come off. So before we install the cable, make sure the ends are bent. So the tip will fit in here correctly. So actually you turn it around and you put this in here. And you make sure the tip is all the way inside the drum. Because if it's sticking out, it can catch on the bracket and cause problems. So we turn the cable drum on the outside of the shaft. And also the cable is on the outside groove. Also remember that the drum will slide back and forth, so we slide it to the right so that it's against the race of the bearing. Notice the gap here so the cable drum won't scrape the bracket. Notice also that the cable is tight on this outside groove. So the cable drum is tight against the bearing. Then one last time I'll try to move the shaft to the left, but it won't move because that vice grip down there is keeping the shaft and the drum tight against the race of the bearing. So this is tight now. It's against the drum. The drum is against the bearing, and now we tighten the cable drum. In order to tighten the drum, we make sure the cable is tight, make sure the drum is against the bearing. We put this in here, tighten it just a little bit, come back, and give it a good snug tight. So the other set screw is on top. We get it started with the butt end of the Allen wrench. The Allen wrench in and turn it at least a quarter turn. It's about as much as you can get on it once the set screw hits the shaft. Notice that the cable is tight with just a little bit of slop. So now we have the end bracket in place, the cable drum in place, the original winder in place, the spring anchor bracket in place, and the spring bolted to the spring anchor bracket. Before winding the spring, you want to make sure you have enough legs on the bottom. When you wind the spring, the bracket's going to pull it this way. So if necessary, we'll add a second leg screw down here. So at this point, I'll be winding the spring. Before doing that, for safety, I put a vice grip about 3 inches above the middle roller. That way if the spring's too strong, it won't come up and knock me off the ladder. Next, I use some winding bars, 1/2-inch bars. It's good to have tape on them. And to make sure that the bars are going all the way into the cone. So you want to have your head just to the inside of the cone. There have been cones over the decades that would break. I don't think any of these that are out there now would have a problem, but if you don't put it in all the way, put the bar in all the way, the end could break off and hit you in the face or knock out an eye. So we turn the spring up. Now this spring gets 10.5 turns. That's what we'll start with, and then see where we go with it. Sometimes you have to adjust it a 1/4 turn either way. So now I'll begin winding. Insert the bar. You always want to hear that click when you insert the bar. I've already taped this, so it's just at the right position. Now, normally we go in 1/4 turns. That's a 1/4. This is a 1/4. Now, depending on how much room there is above the spring, sometimes you can go 2/4. So we're at 4/4 now. So 10.5 turns, 40 plus 2, 42/4. So we're at 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30. It's getting a little stiff now, so I'm going to go 1/4 turns, 1/4 turns at a time. 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42. Now before I tighten the set screws, make a mark, 1 coil over, and then stretch it to the mark. But before we tighten the set screws, we're going to stretch the spring a little less than 1/4 inch. So we'll make a mark out there. We're stretching it thickness of one coil. This is 0.218 instead of 0.250, but gives us something to go by. Okay, we marked it, and my finger tighten the set screws and then back off a quarter turn. And then I lift up, pull the bar at a 45-degree angle like that. That way when I tap it, it doesn't come back. If I don't hold it, it slips back. Notice also that the spring dips in the middle. So watch this dip a little bit when I stretch it. And then while I'm holding this at a 45-degree angle, I tighten the set screws. I didn't need to go all the way to the mark because I could see that this had dipped, indicating that the coils have enough separation so they don't bind when you close the door. A lot of installers don't stretch the springs when they finish winding. 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, when the shaft moves around a little bit, the bearings move around a little bit, the end plates, the springs will bind, then the door won't close all the way. So we tighten the other set screw. And we usually go a half to 3/4 of a turn after the set screw hits the shaft. Now, before I remove the bar, I want to test two things. One is I want to test to make sure the set screws are tight enough. The other thing I want to test is to make sure the spring's not too strong. It's going to come up and hit me. So I'll put the other bar in first, remove the second bar, and then I pull down on it. Notice this is what you want to happen. If the spring is wound properly, and if you have the correct spring, you lift up on it a little bit and the door stays there. So you can go up to the 3-inch point, 3-inch mark where my vice grip is down there. Notice the door stays there. Okay, so this vice grip is for safety. It stops us at 3 inches, but also lets us test the door. Also on the other end of the shaft, we have the other vice grip still there, which will limit the door to a half a turn of travel. So we know that the door balances, and then we're going to test it to make sure it goes up, stays in the middle, stays all the way up. So in order to do that, we'll first remove the vice grip down there and the vice grip at the other end. This vice grip had two purposes. One was to keep the cable drum against the race of the bearing, and also to keep the cable on the drum while we work the other end. Before I remove the vice grip, I just want to check the door again, make sure the balance is okay. What you don't want to have happen is you remove the vice grip and the door comes up. But the way we're testing it, there shouldn't be a problem with it. So I remove this vice grip. And then we go down and test the door. So the next step is to check the balance of the door. Open it, stays halfway. Go all the way up. It stays open. So you can actually operate it with a little finger. It just kind of tight. Finger here. And you can see the little finger. Dan Music. Thank you for watching.